Maybe next time. Learn the law before embarrassing yourself in my courtroom. Officer Daniel Reeves leaned back in his chair with a crooked smile as quiet laughter rolled across the courtroom benches like a slow wave. Naomi Brooks stood alone beside the defense table, her faded charcoal coat hanging loosely against her shoulders, her hands trembling just enough to betray the pressure crushing her chest. Above her, fluorescent lights buzzed softly against the old wooden ceiling of the Cook County Courthouse, casting pale reflections across polished oak floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps and verdicts. The room smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and rainwater drifting in every time the heavy courtroom doors opened. Naomi swallowed carefully and kept her eyes forward even as another officer near the back shook his head and muttered something that made two deputies laugh under their breath. To them, she was already guilty. A black woman in handcuffs always looked guilty to people who stopped listening the moment they saw skin color and a police report. Judge Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her glasses and glanced down toward the prosecution table where Assistant District Attorney Grant Holloway stood buttoning his suit jacket with slow confidence. He looked relaxed, almost bored. Your Honor, Holloway began smoothly. The state has already submitted bodycam evidence confirming Officer Reeves acted appropriately during the disturbance outside West Madison Station. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second. Disturbance. That was the word they kept using. Not terrified little girl. Not frightened crowd. Not panic. Just disturbance. Reeves folded his arms across his chest, the silver badge pinned to his uniform catching the overhead light. She resisted commands, he added casually. My officers responded according to procedure. More nods from the jury box. Naomi could feel them studying her without really seeing her. The tired eyes. The cheap shoes. The exhaustion beneath her makeup she barely had time to apply before sunrise. No one in that room knew she had just finished a 12-hour overnight shift at Mercy General Hospital before being dragged into court at 8:30 in the morning. No one cared that she spent her nights helping strangers breathe through pain while barely sleeping herself. Court reporter continued typing steadily, keys clicking like distant rainfall. Then Holloway pressed a button on the monitor beside the jury. Grainy footage appeared on the courtroom screen. Naomi standing in a crowded subway terminal. Officers approaching. Voices raised. The video paused exactly where she reached toward someone off camera. Holloway faced the jury. And moments after this, he said, Officer Reeves was forced to restrain the defendant for interfering with active police operations. Reeves smirked faintly. Somebody behind Naomi whispered, Here we go again. A quiet chuckle followed. Naomi slowly lifted her head. Her heartbeat felt loud enough to echo off the courtroom walls. Your Honor, she said softly. Judge Whitmore looked up. Yes, Miss Brooks. Naomi's voice barely rose above the hum of the ventilation system, but every word landed clean. That footage was edited. Silence flickered for half a second before Officer Reeves laughed out loud. Edited? He repeated, grinning toward the other officers. You hear this? More laughter spread across the room. Even Holloway smiled slightly. Naomi didn't move, didn't blink. She looked directly at Reeves while the noise slowly faded around them. Then she spoke again, calm and steady. Officer Reeves, she said quietly, your son still has a scar on his left shoulder, doesn't he? The smile disappeared from his face almost instantly. The courtroom did not move. It was as if every sound inside the old building had been pulled out through the ceiling in one breath. Officer Daniel Reeves stared at Naomi Brooks with the color slowly draining from his face while the faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence nobody knew how to break. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a second before awkwardly resuming, the clicking keys suddenly sounding too loud in the stillness. Reeves blinked hard. What did you say? He asked quietly, and this time there was no laughter in his voice. Naomi kept her eyes on him. Calm. Steady. The same calm she used every night inside overcrowded emergency rooms when families panicked and machines beeped non-stop under harsh white lights. Your son, she repeated softly. The scar on his shoulder. From the surgery after the accident on Interstate 94. Reeves shifted in his seat. His hand moved instinctively toward his chest, as though something inside his uniform had suddenly tightened. Prosecutor Holloway frowned and stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, none of this is relevant to the case. Naomi could smell stale coffee somewhere behind her mixed with damp wool coats and old paper. It reminded her of hospital waiting rooms at 3 in the morning. Places where people waited for answers they were terrified to hear. Reeves cleared his throat roughly. You do not know my son. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly before speaking again. His name is Tyler Reeves. He was 9 years old. Silver Honda SUV. Winter storm. 3 cars involved. Reeves stopped breathing for half a second. Holloway turned slowly toward him now. The jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Naomi could feel every eye in the room changing. Not softer. Not kinder. Just confused. She folded her trembling hands together to stop them from shaking. The ambulance was delayed because Lakeshore Drive was backed up, she continued. Your son stopped breathing twice before they reached Mercy General. Reeves swallowed hard. A memory had already started crawling behind his eyes whether he wanted it or not. Snow blowing sideways across flashing emergency lights. Crowded emergency room packed with wet boots, crying voices, and paramedics rushing through automatic doors carrying a little boy wrapped in thermal blankets. Naomi remembered it too. She remembered Tyler's tiny hand clutching weakly at her sleeve while doctors fought to stabilize him under bright surgical lamps. She remembered Officer Reeves standing outside the trauma room, looking completely broken in a way no badge could hide. Back then he had not looked powerful, just terrified. Miss Brooks, Judge Whitmore said carefully, how exactly do you know this information? Naomi took a slow breath. Because I was there. Reeves shook his head once as though refusing to let the memory fully surface. No, he muttered. No, the nurse was, his voice faded. He remembered now. A black nurse wearing navy blue scrubs and tired eyes. A woman who stayed 3 hours past shift change because a frightened little boy would only calm down when she sat beside him. Naomi watched realization spread across his face inch by inch. It almost hurt to see. You brought me coffee from the vending machine at around 4:30 that morning, she said quietly. You said it was the only decent coffee left in the building. Holloway looked completely lost now. The officers near the back no longer smiled. One deputy slowly uncrossed his arms. Another looked down at the floor. Reeves leaned back heavily in his chair. The leather creaked beneath him. Naomi could see the exact moment his confidence cracked. Not because she embarrassed him. Because he finally recognized the woman he had laughed at 20 minutes earlier. Officer Daniel Reeves looked like a man trying to stand upright while the floor beneath him slowly gave way. Confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone now, replaced by something smaller, quieter, harder to hide. Across the courtroom, Naomi Brooks remained still beside the defense table, her tired brown eyes fixed on him with the same calm expression she had worn since the hearing began. But inside her chest, her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She had not planned to say anything about Tyler. Not today. Not here. She only wanted the truth about the subway incident to be heard before another report buried her beneath words like aggressive, resistant, and disorderly. The moment Reeves laughed at her, something old and heavy cracked open inside her memory. Judge Whitmore leaned slightly forward in her chair. Officer Reeves, she said carefully, is what Miss Brooks describing accurate? Reeves did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened once before he finally nodded. There was an accident, he admitted quietly. 2 winters ago. The courtroom air felt heavier now. Even the jurors sat differently, no longer leaning toward the prosecution with easy certainty. Prosecutor Holloway shuffled papers on the table in front of him, but his movements lacked rhythm now, like a man suddenly aware the room had stopped following his script. Naomi glanced briefly toward the courthouse windows. Rain streaked down the glass in crooked silver lines, while downtown traffic crawled through the afternoon below. Somewhere far outside, a siren echoed faintly between buildings before disappearing into distance. It sounded too much like the emergency room. Too much like that night. Tyler Reeves had arrived pale and barely conscious beneath flashing ambulance lights, while snow battered the hospital entrance hard enough to shake the automatic doors. Naomi had been halfway through a double shift already, surviving on stale crackers and cafeteria coffee, her sneakers aching against polished hospital floors. She still remembered Officer Reeves standing in the trauma hallway with snow melting off his shoulders while fear hollowed out his face. He had looked nothing like the man sitting in court today. Then he had not cared about appearances or authority or pride. He had only cared whether his son would survive until sunrise. You stayed with him, Reeves said suddenly, his voice rough around the edges. Naomi looked back at him slowly. Yes. Reeves rubbed one hand across his mouth as if trying to steady himself. Tyler would not let go of your hand. Naomi remembered that part most clearly. The little boy had been frightened of the machines around him, frightened of the noise, the bright lights, the strangers rushing in and out of the room. So she stayed beside him long after her shift technically ended, reading comic books aloud in a quiet voice while snow piled outside hospital windows. She remembered Tyler asking if scars meant people were broken forever. She remembered telling him no. Some scars only prove you survived something hard. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses slowly. "Miss Brooks," she asked, "if you knew Officer Reeves recognized you eventually, why did you not mention any of this sooner?" Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. The answer settled heavily inside her throat before she finally spoke. "Because saving a child should not buy me basic dignity." Silence fell again. Not sharp this time. Heavy. Human. One of the jurors, an older white woman with silver hair, looked down at her folded hands. A deputy near the rear wall shifted uncomfortably beside the wooden doors. Holloway finally stepped forward again, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Your Honor, with respect, this still does not change the facts surrounding the defendant's conduct during the station incident." Naomi slowly turned toward him. "Then play the full footage," she said quietly. "Not the edited clip." Holloway hesitated. Only for a second, but everyone saw it. And for the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, Naomi noticed uncertainty spread across faces that had looked so sure of her guilt before. Grant Holloway forced a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "The state has already submitted the relevant portion of the footage," he said, smoothing the front of his navy suit jacket as though confidence alone could pull control back into the room. Courtroom no longer belonged to him. Naomi Brooks could feel it shifting inch by inch beneath the silence. People were listening now, really listening. Judge Whitmore rested both hands on the bench in front of her. The polished wood reflected the pale courtroom lights in soft streaks across its surface. "Counselor," she said calmly, "did the prosecution submit the complete bodycam recording?" Holloway hesitated. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but in a courtroom, hesitation could sound louder than shouting. "The submitted footage contains the relevant interaction," he answered carefully. Naomi watched one juror slowly narrow his eyes. Another leaned back in his chair with crossed arms, no longer relaxed. Officer Reeves remained motionless beside the witness stand, but his face had changed completely. Earlier that morning, he had looked untouchable inside his pressed uniform and silver badge. Now he looked tired, human, like a man standing too close to a truth he could not stop anymore. Naomi took a slow breath through her nose. Her throat felt dry from hours without water, but her voice stayed steady. "The missing 4 minutes matter," she said softly. Holloway immediately shook his head. "Your Honor, this is turning into emotional theater." Naomi looked toward him. "No," she replied. "It is turning into context." A low murmur spread across the gallery benches before the bailiff called for silence again. Outside, rainwater rolled steadily down the courthouse windows while the late afternoon sky darkened over Chicago. The city lights below had already begun flickering on one by one, tiny gold reflections against wet streets. Naomi remembered seeing the same colors through hospital windows after overnight shifts when exhaustion made the world feel strangely distant. She remembered walking to train stations with aching feet and cold hands while businessmen in pressed coats rushed past her without looking twice. Invisible. That was the word that stayed with her most of her adult life. Invisible until someone needed blame. Judge Whitmore glanced toward the court clerk. "Can the full recording be retrieved?" Holloway stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, the footage has already been reviewed internally by the department." "That was not my question," Whitmore replied. Her voice stayed calm, but the room sharpened around it instantly. Holloway swallowed once. "Yes," he admitted. "The full recording exists." Naomi saw several heads turn immediately toward Officer Reeves. Even the deputies standing near the back wall looked uncomfortable now. Reeves rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly before finally speaking. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I did not edit the footage myself." Holloway looked stunned by the interruption. "Officer Reeves," he warned softly. Reeves ignored him. His eyes stayed fixed somewhere near the defense table, though not directly at Naomi. "But I never asked why 4 minutes were missing either." The words landed heavily in the courtroom air. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. There it was. Not innocence. Not redemption. Just the first crack in a wall built from years of silence and assumptions. Judge Whitmore nodded once toward the clerk. Retrieve the complete footage immediately. Clerk hurried from the room, while tension spread slowly across every wooden bench and polished surface inside the courtroom. Nobody whispered now. Nobody laughed. Holloway returned to his table and opened a legal pad with stiff movements. But Naomi noticed his hand trembling slightly around the pen. Across the room, Marcus Reed, a local court reporter seated near the gallery aisle, quickly flipped open his notebook. Naomi recognized him from television segments covering police misconduct cases. Earlier, he had barely looked at her. Now he watched every expression in the room like a man realizing the story was changing shape in real time. Reeves finally looked directly at Naomi again. His voice dropped lower this time. "Why did you not tell me who you were that night at the station?" Naomi stared at him quietly for a long second before answering. "Because I did not think it should matter who saved your son before you decided whether I deserved respect." Nobody spoke as she crossed the polished floor and handed it to the courtroom technician beside the monitor. Even the sound of rain outside had softened now, turning into a faint hiss against the tall courthouse windows while evening settled slowly over downtown Chicago. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still beside the defense table, though exhaustion pressed heavily into her shoulders. Her legs ached from standing for hours in low heels that had already survived too many hospital shifts and train rides home after midnight. Across the room, Grant Holloway loosened his tie slightly, the movement small but noticeable. Earlier, he had controlled the room with polished certainty. Now he looked like a man calculating damage faster than he could hide it. Judge Whitmore nodded toward the technician. "Play the complete recording." The monitor flickered once before grainy bodycam footage filled the screen. The camera shook slightly with movement as subway station lights flashed across crowded concrete walls and wet tile floors. Voices echoed loudly through the station. Train brakes screamed somewhere in the distance. Naomi watched herself appear near the center of the frame, wearing dark blue hospital scrubs beneath a winter coat, her ID badge still clipped near her shoulder from Mercy General Hospital. She looked exhausted, even on video. Holloway immediately stood. "Your Honor, this footage has not yet been authenticated for." "Sit down, counselor," Whitmore interrupted calmly. Holloway froze before slowly lowering himself back into his chair. Footage continued. Officers moved through the crowded station, responding to a disturbance near the platform entrance. Then the camera angle shifted sharply toward a frightened little girl standing near the edge of the crowd, crying uncontrollably while people pushed past her without stopping. Naomi's chest tightened immediately. She remembered the child. 7 years old at most. Pink winter hat. Tiny hands shaking badly enough she could barely hold onto the backpack hanging from one shoulder. The station had been chaos that night after a false report about a weapon sent commuters rushing in every direction. "Slow it down," Judge Whitmore said quietly. The technician obeyed. The courtroom watched in complete silence now. On screen, Officer Reeves moved quickly through the crowd, trying to clear the platform area. Then the little girl stumbled backward near the edge of the stairs. Naomi stepped toward her instantly. Not aggressive, not threatening, protective. She wrapped one arm around the child and pulled her safely away from the surge of people. The bodycam audio crackled beneath overlapping voices and train announcements. "Ma'am, move back," one officer shouted. Naomi tried to answer while shielding the little girl against her side. Then the footage suddenly shifted again. Another officer stepped into frame briefly. "She is just helping the kid," a voice muttered from somewhere behind the camera. Reeves paused. The courtroom remained frozen. Naomi heard someone near the jury quietly exhale. On screen, the frightened child clung tightly to Naomi's coat, while Naomi crouched slightly to calm her. There was no resistance, no threat, no aggression. Just a tired emergency room nurse trying to protect a terrified little girl in the middle of confusion. Then another piece of audio surfaced through static and station noise. Faint, but clear enough. Why is it always them causing problems? The sentence hit the courtroom like cold steel. Nobody moved. Nobody even shifted in their seats. Holloway stared at the screen without blinking. One of the deputies near the wall lowered his eyes immediately. Marcus Reed stopped writing altogether. Naomi did not look toward anyone. She kept her gaze fixed on the monitor while heat rose slowly behind her eyes. She remembered hearing those words that night. Remembered pretending not to hear them, because survival sometimes meant swallowing humiliation before it crushed you completely. The footage continued another 30 seconds before Reeves himself appeared fully on screen again. He looked directly at Naomi in the recording. Then he looked down at the little girl wrapped against her side, and his entire posture changed. The courtroom watched him hesitate. The paused frame on the courtroom monitor cast a cold blue glow across every face in the room. Naomi Brooks could see the frozen image reflected faintly in the polished surface of the judge's bench, in the brass railings. Even in the dark lenses of the television cameras, reporters had quietly rolled into the back of the courtroom during the last 10 minutes. Nobody cared about a routine hearing earlier that afternoon. Now every seat in the gallery was filled. The little girl on the screen clung tightly to Naomi's coat, while Officer Reeves stood inches away, caught in the middle of a moment nobody expected the footage to reveal. Judge Whitmore folded her hands slowly. "Continue," she said. The recording resumed. Subway announcements echoed through the station while commuters rushed past in blurred streaks beneath fluorescent lights. Naomi watched her own exhausted face on screen as she knelt slightly beside the child, speaking softly enough that the bodycam microphone barely captured her words. "You are okay, sweetheart. Stay close to me." The little girl nodded through tears. Then Officer Reeves appeared again in frame, breathing heavily from pushing through the crowd. Naomi remembered exactly how cold the station air had felt that night, sharp enough to sting her lungs after 12 straight hours under hospital lights. On the video, Reeves looked at the child first, then at Naomi. Something unreadable crossed his face even back then. Confusion maybe, or conflict. One of the officers behind him muttered another irritated comment beneath his breath, but Reeves raised one hand slightly, stopping him. Courtroom remained perfectly silent except for the crackling audio from the monitor. Naomi felt the tension inside her chest shifting now into something stranger. Sadness more than anger. She had replayed that night in her mind for weeks after her arrest, wondering if things would have turned out differently if she looked less tired, dressed differently, sounded calmer, smiled more carefully. Women like her learned early that survival often depended on appearing harmless even while exhausted. The footage moved forward another minute. On screen, Reeves finally addressed Naomi directly. "Ma'am," he said more quietly this time. "Let me get the kid somewhere safe." Remembered how frightened the little girl had been after getting separated from her mother in the chaos. On screen, Naomi spoke again. "She is scared. Let me stay until her mother gets here." Reeves paused. The footage captured him studying Naomi's hospital ID badge for the first time. Mercy General Hospital. Registered nurse. The courtroom technician froze the frame automatically when Reeves leaned slightly closer toward the badge. Judge Whitmore looked toward the witness stand. "Officer Reeves," she asked softly, "is this when you recognized her profession?" Reeves stared at the screen for several long seconds before answering. "No," he admitted quietly. "I saw the badge. But I still saw a problem before I saw a person." The words settled heavily into the room. Nobody shifted. Nobody looked away. Naomi felt warmth sting behind her eyes again, but she forced herself to stay steady. Marcus Reed slowly removed his glasses near the gallery aisle and rubbed one hand across his face like a man struggling to process what he was witnessing. Holloway no longer touched his notes. His legal pad sat abandoned on the prosecution table beneath harsh fluorescent light. Reeves finally stood from the witness chair without being asked. The movement sounded loud against the wooden floor. He looked older suddenly, smaller somehow despite the uniform. "Your Honor," he said carefully, his voice rough with something close to shame. "The arrest report states Miss Brooks escalated the situation." Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second as silence spread through the courtroom again, deeper now than before, because this time it carried the weight of truth finally spoken out loud. For a long moment, nobody inside the courtroom seemed to remember how to move. The city outside continued without them. Rain slid down the courthouse windows. Headlights drifted through wet Chicago streets below. Somewhere far beyond the heavy wooden walls, a train horn echoed faintly across the evening air. But inside Department 12, everything stood still beneath the pale fluorescent lights. Naomi Brooks slowly opened her eyes again after hearing Officer Reeves finally speak the truth aloud. She had imagined this moment differently 100 times during sleepless nights after her arrest. In some versions he apologized immediately. In others he denied everything until the end. But reality felt stranger than either. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden redemption, Just a tired white officer standing in silence beneath the weight of his own choices, while a black woman he once dismissed remained the calmest person in the room. Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly in her chair, studying the paused frame on the courtroom monitor. Naomi holding the little girl beside the subway stairs. Reeves standing nearby, caught between procedure and humanity. "Officer Reeves," the judge said quietly, "why was this section removed from the submitted footage?" Reeves looked down at the polished wooden railing beside the witness stand. His fingers tightened against it briefly before he answered. "I told myself it did not matter." The courtroom stayed silent. Reeves swallowed hard. The department wanted a clean timeline for the report. "I let them simplify what happened." Holloway stood quickly. "Your Honor, I object to the implication that the prosecution knowingly concealed evidence. Personal guilt. Institutional guilt. The kind people felt when they realized they had believed the easiest version of a story because it required less effort than questioning power." Reeves finally looked directly at Naomi again. "When I saw you at the station that night," he said softly, "I remembered your face. I just could not place it." Naomi listened without speaking. "But after the arrest report was filed," he continued, "I knew exactly who you were." Several jurors shifted immediately. One man, near the back of the gallery, exhaled under his breath. Naomi felt her heartbeat slow strangely instead of rise. Somewhere deep inside her, exhaustion was replacing anger little by little. Reeves rubbed one hand across his forehead before continuing. "I should have corrected the report the next morning." He paused. "I did not." The words landed heavier than any apology could have. Naomi stared at the floor briefly, watching soft reflections from the courtroom lights ripple across the polished wood beneath her shoes. She thought about all the mornings she had walked home from Mercy General while the city woke around her. Delivery trucks, coffee shops opening, businessmen checking phones without looking at the people beside them on sidewalks. Invisible people, women like her, men like the janitor who always held the hospital elevator open for everyone else before himself. The security guard who worked double shifts and still smiled at exhausted nurses at 6 in the morning. People the world only noticed after something went wrong. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses slowly again. "Miss Brooks," she said carefully, "would you like to respond?" Naomi lifted her eyes toward the bench. Every face in the courtroom waited for anger, for accusation, for revenge sharpened by humiliation. Instead, Naomi spoke softly enough that people leaned forward just to hear her. "I spent 15 years working emergency rooms," she said. "You learn very quickly that panic makes people stop seeing each other clearly." Reeves lowered his eyes. Naomi continued, "But fear is not the same thing as cruelty. Fear can change. Cruelty chooses not to." Nobody moved. Naomi's voice remained steady despite the tears gathering faintly along her lower eyelids. "I never needed special treatment," she said quietly. "I only needed the same humanity I gave your son that night." Reeves closed his eyes briefly as though the sentence physically hurt to hear. And for the first time all day, the courtroom no longer looked at Naomi Brooks like a defendant. They looked at her like the only person in the room who still understood what dignity sounded like. The silence inside the courtroom no longer felt cold. It felt heavy, almost sacred, like the moment after a storm finally passes and people step outside to see what is left standing. Naomi Brooks remained beside the defense table with her hands folded gently in front of her, while evening shadows stretched longer across the courthouse floor. The rain outside had nearly stopped now. Thin streaks of amber sunset pushed through the clouds beyond the tall windows, washing the old wooden courtroom in soft gold light that made everything feel quieter than before. Judge Whitmore looked down at the papers spread across her bench, then toward the prosecution table where Grant Holloway sat motionless beside untouched legal files. The confidence that had once sharpened his posture was gone completely now. After reviewing the complete footage, the judge said carefully, "This court finds insufficient evidence to support the charge against Miss Brooks." She had prepared herself for humiliation, for another exhausting fight, for walking home beneath Chicago streetlights wondering how many more years she would spend proving she deserved basic fairness. Instead, the courtroom sat in complete stillness around her while truth settled into every corner of the room. Judge Whitmore continued speaking. "Furthermore, this court is formally recommending an internal review regarding the handling and omission of evidence connected to this case." Nobody expected him to anymore. Marcus Reed quietly closed his notebook and stared toward Naomi with an expression somewhere between admiration and regret. The deputies near the back wall no longer looked at her with suspicion. One older officer even shifted awkwardly before giving the smallest nod in her direction. Naomi noticed it, but did not react. Across the room, Officer Daniel Reeves remained standing beside the witness chair. His uniform still looked sharp beneath the courtroom lights, but something inside him had clearly unraveled. He looked less like an officer now and more like a father carrying the weight of a mistake he could not undo. Slowly, he stepped away from the witness stand. The sound of his shoes against the wooden floor echoed softly through the courtroom as every eye followed him. Naomi straightened slightly, unsure what he intended to say. Reeves stopped a few feet in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The courthouse ventilation hummed quietly overhead, while fading sunlight reflected against the brass railings between them. Then Reeves reached up slowly and unclipped the silver badge from the front of his uniform. The faint metallic sound seemed louder than it should have. Several people in the gallery visibly stiffened. Reeves looked down at the badge resting in his hand before finally speaking. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice rough and unsteady. Reeves swallowed hard. "And this morning, I walked into this courtroom and laughed at you before I even heard your side." His grip tightened briefly around the badge. There is no excuse for that. Nobody moved. Even Judge Whitmore remained completely still behind the bench. Reeves looked directly at Naomi now, no longer avoiding her eyes. "You showed my child compassion before you even knew his last name," he said quietly. "I should have shown you the same humanity without needing a reason." Naomi stared at him for several long seconds. Anger she carried for weeks had softened somewhere during the hearing into something sadder and more complicated. She saw genuine shame in his face now. Not performative guilt, not courtroom strategy, just truth. Slowly, Naomi stepped closer and gently pushed the badge back toward him. Reeves looked startled. "Keep it," she said softly. "A badge is not the problem. Forgetting the people underneath it is." Reeves lowered his head immediately, emotion flickering across his face too quickly for him to hide. And in the fading golden light of the courtroom, nobody watching could remember the last time silence had sounded so honest. By the time Naomi Brooks stepped out of the courthouse, the rain had stopped completely. Chicago glowed beneath the fading evening sky, streets slick with reflections from traffic lights, and storefront windows stretching across wet pavement like ribbons of gold and red. Cold air brushed softly against her face as the heavy courthouse doors closed behind her with a deep echo that seemed to follow her down the stone steps. For the first time in weeks, her chest no longer felt tight. Not lighter exactly, just quieter. Reporters crowded near the sidewalk beneath umbrellas and camera lights, their voices overlapping in sharp bursts the moment they spotted her emerging from the building. "Miss Brooks, do you have a statement? Do you believe the department targeted you unfairly? Will you file a civil suit?" Naomi paused halfway down the steps, the city wind tugging lightly at the edge of her charcoal coat. Flashing camera lights reflected across the courthouse windows behind her, while television vans lined the curb under glowing street lamps. She looked tired, more tired than victorious. After a long moment, she simply shook her head gently. "I think people should watch the full footage," she said softly. "That is enough." Then she kept walking. The reporters slowly lowered their microphones one by one as though realizing no headline they wrote tonight would sound stronger than the silence she left behind. Across the street, commuters hurried beneath train tracks and bus stop lights, unaware that inside one old courtroom, something invisible had shifted a few inches closer toward honesty. Naomi pulled her coat tighter against the November air and walked toward the elevated train station 3 blocks away. Her heels clicked softly against damp concrete, while steam drifted upward from sewer grates into the cooling evening. She passed a man selling roasted peanuts beside a corner cart, the warm smell briefly filling the air around her. Somewhere nearby, jazz music floated faintly from an open restaurant door before disappearing beneath the rumble of traffic. Life moved on. It always did. Behind her, high above the courthouse entrance, Officer Daniel Reeves still stood near the tall windows of the second-floor hallway watching her disappear into the city crowd below. He had not spoken since she handed his badge back. The polished silver shield still rested heavily in his palm, while courtroom staff quietly packed files and switched off lights around him. Judge Whitmore passed him once on her way out, but said nothing. Some lessons sounded louder without words. Reeves stared through the rain-streaked glass toward the woman who had once sat beside his frightened son during the worst night of his life, asking for nothing in return. And he realized something that settled painfully deep in his chest. Naomi Brooks had shown him mercy twice now. Once in a hospital room, and once inside that courtroom. Down on the street, Naomi reached the station platform just as the northbound train arrived with a metallic groan against the tracks. Warm air rushed outward as the doors slid open. A little girl standing beside her tugged gently on her mother's sleeve and pointed upward toward the courthouse. "Mom," she whispered, "that is the nurse from the news." The mother glanced toward Naomi briefly before offering a small smile. Not pity, not curiosity, respect. Naomi smiled back softly and stepped onto the train. The doors closed behind her with a muted hiss while city lights flickered across the windows as the train slowly pulled away into the Chicago night. Naomi leaned her head lightly against the cool glass and watched reflections blur together outside. Her phone vibrated quietly inside her coat pocket. One new message. Unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "Thank you for saving my dad too. Tyler Reeves." Naomi stared at the screen while the train rattled steadily through darkness beneath the city. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she smiled. Outside the window, Chicago disappeared into rain-soaked light and silence.